A gentleman's manners hide a darker stain. Welcome to Echo Misteriosa. I am your host, Ravella. Share in the comments where you're listening from. I always enjoy your words. Your voices make this journey special. Let's uncover the case. It was one of those unusually chill mornings of early spring when the fog that clings to the streets of London seems to slink into the very bones. The fire in our hearth had been coaxed into reluctant life, and Sherlock Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, the fingertips of each hand pressed together in quiet contemplation. He had not spoken in over an hour. The Morning Post had come and gone with little of consequence save a pamphlet on the misclassification of Chinese pottery and a letter from a woman in Tunbridge Wells claiming to have been poisoned by her sister-in-law's plum preserves. Holmes had dismissed both with an idle glance and returned to his mental solitude. I, on the other hand, had taken to reorganizing my notes from our recent excursion to Oxford, where Holmes had put an end to a curious case involving a stolen manuscript and a faked drowning in the Isis. I was just about to ring for more coffee when there came a knock at the door, urgent and rhythmic, like the ticking of a watch about to run down. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a tall, well-groomed gentleman in a fine tweed coat, though clearly shaken. His eyes were wide, and he clutched something tightly in his gloved hand. He removed his hat as he stepped into the room. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice strained. Holmes opened his eyes, nodded slightly, and gestured to the armchair across from him. "You're expected, though we have never met," Holmes said. "Please do sit. You have come from the Athenaeum Club by way of Regent Street, though not directly. The left hem of your trousers indicates an alleyway detour, likely to avoid being seen. Am I correct?" The gentleman blinked. "Quite. How did you know?" Holmes waved the matter aside. "Please continue. You have something of grave concern in your hand. I suggest you tell us the full of it before we all grow older." The man looked down at his hand, as though remembering it for the first time. He opened it slowly. There, crumpled and faintly stained, was a handkerchief, white linen with a red monogram in the corner. It was marred by a vivid splash of crimson. "I found this in my brother's study early this morning," the man said. "My name is Horace Fenwick. My brother, Basil Fenwick, is, or was, a senior clerk at the Home Office. When I arrived at his residence in Richmond just before breakfast, the butler could not find him. His room had been slept in, the fire burned low, but there was no sign of Basil. Then I saw this, on the carpet by his writing desk." Watson leaned forward. "Blood?" Fenwick nodded. "Yes, at least I believe it is. But there's no sign of struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, nothing. Just that handkerchief, and my brother is gone." Holmes's eyes glittered. "You did not notify the police?" "No," Fenwick said, glancing nervously toward the window. "I came directly to you. You see, my brother's position involves sensitive communications. If this is some form of abduction or worse, I feared a scandal, but I also feared—" "Yes," Holmes pressed. Fenwick swallowed. "I feared that my brother might not have left unwillingly." There was a long silence. Holmes stood, went to the window and looked out at the thickening fog. "You have done wisely, Mr. Fenwick. This case has the scent of significance. Watson, your coat, if you please. We go to Richmond." And with that, Sherlock Holmes turned from the window and strode for his coat, the bloody handkerchief already tucked neatly into his inner pocket. The hansom cab rattled through the mist-laden streets of London, its wheels splashing up rivulets from the glistening cobblestones as we made our way toward Richmond. Holmes, as was his custom, sat in silence, his eyes closed and his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. It was a posture I had come to recognize not as one of rest, but of intense inward activity. I dared not interrupt him, though my mind was afire with questions. At last, as the houses thinned and the outlines of the city gave way to the wider lanes of the southern boroughs, Holmes spoke without opening his eyes. "Watson, what do you make of our client?" I considered for a moment. Nervous, undoubtedly. Well-spoken, educated, perhaps from money. Loyal to his brother, sufficiently so to avoid scandal at the risk of propriety. But evasive, perhaps. Holmes gave a faint nod, his lips curling in a whisper of amusement. Quite so. Mr. Horace Fenwick is a man who chose to withhold certain truths, and not for want of trust in us. No, his hesitation lies elsewhere. You suspect he knows more than he admitted? I suspect, said Holmes, opening his eyes, that he suspects something he dares not voice. That handkerchief monogrammed with a B, no? Too deliberate. Why not conceal it? Why bring it at all unless to frame the narrative a certain way? Something troubles me about the simplicity of its discovery. You believe it was placed? I believe it was meant to be found. We arrived shortly thereafter at the Fenwick residence, a respectable Georgian house with ivy clinging to its pale stone walls and a gravel drive muffled by fog. A manservant, older and somewhat stiff in manner, greeted us at the door. Horace Fenwick reappeared within moments, his coat now buttoned, his manner brisk. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said. "I had the household left untouched. I thought it best." Holmes nodded. "Show us to the study." The room in question was precisely what one would expect of a bureaucratic bachelor, lined with shelves of books, a polished walnut desk near the window, and a single wing-back chair facing the fireplace, now cold and grey. Holmes went first to the rug, kneeling carefully where Horace had found the handkerchief. He examined the fibers of the carpet with his lens, brushing aside a few stray strands. "No blood on the carpet itself," he murmured. "Merely the stain on the handkerchief. Curious. Mr. Fenwick, might I ask, was this window locked when you arrived?" Horace nodded. "Yes. Latched from the inside. I checked it myself." Holmes examined the casement latches. "Undisturbed? And the fireplace?" "Unused since the night before. Ashes only." Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes turned his attention next to the desk. On its surface lay a blotter, a fountain pen, and a single letter unopened, its seal bearing the insignia of the Home Office. "Your brother often worked from home?" "Frequently. His position dealt with confidential matters. He often wrote memos from this very room." Holmes slipped on a pair of thin gloves and opened a drawer in the desk. He removed a bundle of correspondence tied with string, flicking through the envelopes. "Anything out of the ordinary in your brother's manner of late?" Horace hesitated. He had been distant, distracted. Not quite himself, though I attributed it to the strain of his work. He had spoken vaguely about a transfer or reassignment, something he viewed with distaste. Holmes lifted a thick folio of papers and examined it briefly before his eyes narrowed. He drew forth a small, folded scrap from between two reports. Unfolding it revealed a newspaper clipping, nearly a month old. It was a death notice, simply printed. "Bartholomew Green, aged 48, of Dorset Street, passed suddenly. A quiet man of unremarkable occupation. No surviving family. Interment private." Holmes held it up wordlessly for Watson and me to see. Horace paled. "I've never seen that before," he said. Holmes pocketed the clipping. "Tell me, does the name mean anything to you?" Horace shook his head slowly. "No, not at all." Holmes made a brief note in his pocketbook. "Very well. Dr. Watson and I must see the rest of the house, particularly your brother's bedchamber and the rear exit." We were led upstairs, where Basil Fenwick's bedroom stood in immaculate order. The bed had indeed been slept in, though neatly. Holmes examined the bedside table, noting the clock had stopped at 2:17. Beside it sat a book, Plato's Republic, marked a third of the way through. Did your brother have any house guests recently? Holmes asked as we descended again. None that I know of. Basil was a private man. His life was very structured, dull even. Structured lives can contain the most compelling aberrations, Holmes replied, then asked to see the back of the property. We exited through the kitchen and into the small garden. Here the fog hung heavier, and the grass sparkled faintly with dew. Holmes crouched beside the garden path, where faint impressions disturbed the soil. Someone stood here, he murmured, recently. Heavier than the average man. Look, heel prints deep. Pacing. Watson leaned in. Waiting for someone? Or watching, Holmes said grimly. And note, no prints leading away. Whoever it was came and went another way. Horace, who had been watching from the threshold, now spoke. There is a side gate. It opens into a narrow alley that connects to the main road. Holmes nodded. Show me. We followed him along the path to a small wrought iron gate set in a high brick wall. It was ajar. The bolt is rusted, Holmes observed, but the gate opens cleanly. Someone used this route with familiarity. Returning inside, Holmes stood for a long moment in the hallway, gazing at nothing in particular. Mr. Fenwick, he said at last, when did you last speak with your brother? Horace blinked. 2 days ago. Briefly, over the telephone. He was abrupt. I assumed he was distracted. And he did not mention this Bartholomew Green. No. Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then, Watson, we returned to Baker Street. I must consult the index. Mr. Fenwick, do not disturb anything further in the house. I suspect this matter is more complex than a mere disappearance. As the cab bore us away again, I looked at Holmes. You believe there is foul play? I believe, said Holmes slowly, that Mr. Basil Fenwick stumbled into something that cost another man his life, a man few would miss. And I believe that bloody handkerchief was a message, not from the assailant, but from Basil himself. A message? Indeed. But not in the blood itself. No. Why leave a blood-stained handkerchief and nothing else? No weapon, no struggle, no note. He had only one thing to say, and he said it in red. I shook my head. But what could he have meant? Holmes's eyes lit with that peculiar fire I knew so well. That, my dear Watson, is what I intend to find out. But to do so, I must reacquaint myself with the late Mr. Bartholomew Green, and with a name I've not heard in 5 years, a name once whispered in corridors and erased from files. He turned to me, his voice lowering. Thornley Briar. I stared at him, the name unfamiliar, and yet tinged with a chill I could not explain. Holmes leaned back, his voice barely audible above the rumble of the wheels. If I am right, Watson, we are not chasing a disappearance. We are chasing a ghost. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the fog had thickened into a pale curtain that blurred the gas lamps and muffled the sounds of passing cabs. Holmes discarded his coat with the absent-mindedness of a man lost in thought, and strode straight for the bookcase where he kept his vast and peculiar index, a chaotic system of clippings, notes, dossiers, and curiosities known only to himself. It was, in truth, more akin to a living organism than a filing system, and only Holmes knew how to draw breath from its lungs. Thornley Briar, he muttered, extracting a worn leather binder labeled G to I, a name buried deeper than most. I sat across from him, nursing a cup of cooling tea, and watched as he turned page after page with growing intensity. At last, with a triumphant sound in his throat, he pulled free a single sheet, faded, smudged, but legible. He read silently for a moment. Listen to this, Watson, he said. Thornley Briar, alias H. Allard, known operative in the suspected Greystone cipher circle, once affiliated with a splinter group of former government clerks turned blackmailers, last seen 5 years ago, allegedly killed in a warehouse fire in Lambeth. Body never recovered. File marked incomplete. Home Office interest ceased abruptly. He handed me the page. "Greystone cipher?" I asked, brow furrowed. A minor but troubling affair. Men in positions of clerical trust passing along low-grade government information to criminal contacts. Not treason technically, too small in scope, but a corrosion from within. The sort of affair they prefer to smother rather than prosecute. One suspect was captured, another vanished, and Thornley Briar, cleverest of the lot, was presumed dead. But if Briar is alive, then Basil Fenwick may have crossed paths with a ghost, Holmes said, standing and pacing the room. "Watson, consider this. Basil finds a man who was supposed to be dead, perhaps recognizes him, perhaps the man recognizes him. An old file is disturbed. Quiet inquiries are made. Then Basil disappears. A handkerchief appears with no explanation, a clipping about a man with no known family, no job and no ties. Bartholomew Green. Green, I suspect, was not Green at all. You think Green was Briar? I think it very likely, and I think Basil knew it." There was a long pause as the implications settled between us. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats echoed faintly. Holmes resumed his seat and steepled his fingers once more. "But the method, Watson. We must always ask, why this method? A bloody handkerchief, no struggle, no note, and Green's obituary, so bland, so intentionally unobtrusive. Someone went to great lengths to make it appear as if nothing at all had happened." A knock at the door interrupted us, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a note, sealed in pale blue. "It was delivered by hand just now, Mr. Holmes. No name given." Holmes opened it and scanned the contents, his brows lifting a fraction. It reads, "If you value discretion, do not pursue Mr. Fenwick's disappearance. Let ghosts lie. There is danger in the air. A friend." No address, no signature, but look at the paper. He held it toward me. It was thick, fine stock. Government issue. Barely perceptible at the corner was an embossing, "GWD Government Wireless Division," Holmes murmured. Not a public-facing entity. Only someone within would have such stationery, a warning from within the machine. I leaned forward. "Then whoever sent this wants me silent, which tells me I'm on the correct trail." Holmes stood again. "There is one man who may know more, if he has not drunk himself to ruin since the last time I saw him. Inspector Percy Greer, formerly of the Special Branch. He handled the Greystone case before it was buried. You remember him, dour, fond of gin, loathed paperwork." I did indeed recall Greer, a man whose trench coat seemed to carry the weight of the empire itself, and whose eyes betrayed the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless bureaucratic compromises. "We'll find him at his usual haunt if he's not in the morgue," Holmes said, already reaching for his coat. Within the hour, we stood in the low-lit interior of the Three Foxes, a public house tucked between an ironmonger and a fish stall on Gillingham Street. The air smelled of damp wood and regret. In the back corner, hunched over a whiskey like a man communing with the dead, sat Greer. He looked up as we approached, recognition dull in his eyes. "Well, if it isn't London's bloodhound and his chronicler," he muttered. "Come to drag me back into the mire, have you?" Holmes slid into the booth without invitation. "We need to speak of Thornley Briar." Greer went very still. "Dead 5 years, burned to ash in Lambeth." Holmes placed the obituary of Bartholomew Green on the table. "Dead again, it seems. Or not quite." Greer read it, then let out a sigh through his nose. He always was a slippery bastard. "He's reappeared, under a different name, possibly involved in the disappearance of a Home Office clerk. Basil Fenwick. Familiar?" Greer hesitated, then nodded. "Fenwick's name came up once or twice. Nothing serious. Not corrupt. If anything, too clean. He kept to himself. Word was he'd been digging through old memoranda, cross-checking personnel files, looking for something." Holmes leaned forward. "Did he find it?" Greer drained his glass. I don't know, but I do know that if Briar's alive, he didn't crawl out from under a rock for no reason. Someone called him back, or something frightened him out of hiding. Any idea who might have protected him all these years? Greer gave a humorless laugh. Only two kinds of people hide men like Briar, the ones who want to use him and the ones who already have. We left the pub as the gas lamps flickered into deeper gloom. Holmes was silent until we turned onto Baker Street once more. Watson, he said. Greer confirmed what I feared. Basil was looking into something that someone buried, something Briar didn't want found. That handkerchief was not a sign of violence. It was a flag, a marker. Basil left it because he wanted someone, anyone, to realize he hadn't vanished of his own volition. What do we do now? We go to Dorset Street. We speak to those who saw Bartholomew Green last. Perhaps someone noticed the man behind the mask, and if they didn't... He looked toward the dense shroud of fog curling around the chimneys like fingers. Then we follow the mask until it falls off. I felt a chill despite my coat. We were no longer dealing with a simple disappearance. We were walking into a shadow of old conspiracies and names best left buried. But Holmes, with that peculiar light in his eye, looked as though he had never been more alive. The walk to Dorset Street took us deep into the belly of London, into the East End where the fog hung lower and the streets narrowed like the city's own grimacing mouth. There, the gas lamps sputtered reluctantly, and faces vanished behind soot-darkened curtains before we passed. The pavements were slick, the air heavy with coal smoke and last night's gin. It was a district that wore secrets like second skin. Holmes moved with the calm certainty of a man accustomed to such places, eyes scanning every facade, every figure that lingered too long in a doorway. He said little, and I did not press him. Dorset Street, once infamous and now merely forgotten, was the sort of place where identities dissolved, where one could vanish and never be spoken of again. If Bartholomew Green had lived here, it was not because he had wanted to be found. We arrived at number 17, a crumbling boarding house tucked between an undertaker's parlor and an oyster cart that had seen better decades. The windows were stained yellow from inside, and a faint smell of boiled meat wafted through the cracks in the door. Holmes knocked twice with the knuckle of his cane. After a moment, the door creaked open. A woman in a tattered shawl squinted at us through watery eyes. Her face bore the lines of hard years, but her bearing still hinted at some long-forgotten pride. "We're not taking boarders tonight," she said. "Nor selling, and if it's charity you want..." "We want a word concerning Mr. Bartholomew Green," Holmes said smoothly, doffing his hat. "We were told he stayed here, not long ago." The name seemed to startle her. Her lips twitched. "Bartholomew, was it? Quiet sort, paid regular. Not one for conversation. What about him?" "He's dead," I said gently. "Or so the notice claimed. We'd like to know what you remember. When did you last see him?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in then. Ain't proper talking on doorsteps in this street." The hallway was dim and smelled of mildew. We were led to a parlor that had been repurposed into a sort of office, though the desk and broken mirror spoke of disuse. She sat stiffly on a faded armchair and lit a stub of candle. "He came and went," she said. "Mostly at night. Paid me 2 weeks in. Advance, always cash. Never gave me no trouble." "Did he receive visitors?" Holmes asked. "Not as I saw, but he was careful. Never lingered in the common rooms. Used the rear stairs. Walked like a man who'd been watched before." "Anything odd in his behavior?" I pressed. "Did he seem afraid?" She frowned. Not afraid, but cautious. One time I found him burning paper in the hearth. Tiny scraps like he wanted nothing left. Wouldn't look me in the eye for days after. "Did he speak to you of work, of a past?" "Not a word. Just kept to himself. Called me madam like I was his landlady in Belgravia." She snorted. "But he was no gentleman. His hands were wrong." Holmes looked up. Wrong? Rough. Calloused in the tips, not the palms. Like he did fine work, delicate but often. Typist, maybe. Or cipher work. Holmes's gaze sharpened. What happened to his belongings? He asked. Gone, she said. 2 nights before that death notice, a man came. Said he was a cousin. Had a paper from the coroner's office. Took the trunk, his books, even his ashtray. I didn't argue. Describe him. Mid-40s. Quiet voice. Grey coat. Pale. Seemed nervous. Kept his hat on indoors. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Did he sign anything? A receipt. I still have it. I don't toss papers. It's a habit. She rose stiffly, opened a drawer, and handed over a folded slip. Holmes examined it closely, then passed it to me. It was scrawled hastily, signed in a firm but unadorned hand. H. Allard. I felt the name strike like flint. That was one of Briar's known aliases. Holmes nodded. The ghost claimed his own remains. He turned back to the woman. You've been most helpful. One last thing. Did he leave any messages? Notes? Anything he might have written? She shook her head, then paused. There was a scrap. I found it under the floorboard when I cleaned after. Almost tossed it, but it struck me odd. She reached into the drawer again and handed Holmes a folded square of paper. He held it under the candlelight. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. The message was brief. If they come asking, say nothing. Tell them I was kind. Tell them I was already gone. No name, no date. Holmes tucked the note carefully into his coat. Thank you, madam. If you should recall anything else, send word to Baker Street. We departed without further delay, and Holmes remained silent until we were several streets distant. He knew he would be followed, he said at last. Briar, Green, whatever name he wore, he was preparing for death or vanishment, and he did not intend to be mourned. Then who retrieved the body? No one. I suspect no body was found at all. But then... Holmes raised a hand. Watson, the false cousin, the faked obituary, the vanishing act, it's all. Sleight of hand. We are not chasing a disappearance. We are unraveling a controlled demolition of identity. As we turned the corner, a figure emerged from the mist and approached. A boy, thin, quick-eyed. One of Holmes's irregulars. He handed Holmes a note and vanished again into the fog. Holmes read it swiftly. From Greer. Just received word from a contact. Basil Fenwick spotted yesterday near Shadwell Basin, alive, disoriented, and asking for room number 9. Taken in by a local constable. Then vanished again before identification. Officially, not logged. Room number 9, I repeated. Holmes was already striding faster. It's beginning to align, Watson. Someone doesn't want Fenwick found. And room number 9, that's not random. That's a code. A code? In Whitehall slang, room 9 is whispered as the old euphemism for a ghost office, a place used off the record. Interrogations, black files, secrets given form. If Basil invoked it, then he's either seen something he wasn't meant to, or he's being held there. I quickened my pace beside him. Then we're running out of time. Holmes nodded, the fog clinging to his coat as though reluctant to let him go. And somewhere in all this, he said, voice low, Thornley Briar is either pulling strings or having his own cut. We walked faster, and the city seemed to close in tighter around us. We did not return to Baker Street. Holmes, once fixed upon the scent, grew impatient with the mere idea of retreat. Instead, we turned eastward, following the curve of the Thames toward Shadwell Basin, where the mists off the water thickened into a shroud that swallowed the gaslight and gave every alley the menace of a riddle. The basin itself was silent, save for the soft lap of water against the moorings and the occasional groan of a barge shifting in its sleep. This was not a place of polite curiosity, but one where secrets festered just beneath the surface, like rot beneath a painted plank. Holmes knew the area with unnerving precision, leading me down a narrow lane flanked by locked warehouses and rusted iron stairwells. We stopped before a disused dockmaster's post, a stone structure with a soot-blackened chimney and windows blind with grime. "This is where Fenwick was last seen," Holmes said softly, eyes scanning the wet cobblestones. The constable who picked him up was stationed nearby. "I made inquiries once before in this district, during the oarsman's poisoning. Same habits, same faces, and the same silences." He knocked thrice on the warped door. There was a long pause, then it opened, just a crack. The face that appeared was sharp-eyed, pinched and suspicious. A man of middle years, he wore a constable's uniform that had seen better tailoring. "Who's asking?" he rasped. Holmes slipped a card through the crack. "Sherlock Holmes. You detained a man yesterday, possibly confused, possibly in shock, who referred to something called Room Number 9. You did not log it." The constable looked from the card to Holmes, then to me, and finally to the darkness behind him. After a moment, he opened the door wider and stepped aside. "I'm not saying I know anything," he muttered as we entered, "but I'll tell you what I saw." He came from the quay, drenched to the skin, looked like he'd been walking in circles for hours. Clothes were rumpled. Didn't say his name at first, just kept repeating, "They knew." They shouldn't have known. It was supposed to stay buried. Over and over. Holmes said nothing, but his eyes gleamed. "I brought him in, tried to calm him," the man continued. "He wouldn't sit still, wouldn't stop talking, and then he froze, like something clicked in his head. Looked me dead in the eye and said, 'Don't take me there. Not Room 9, not again.' I hadn't said a word about no such place." "You're sure of his name?" I asked. Eventually gave it. Basil Fenwick. Then said I'd be safer forgetting it. "What happened next?" The constable hesitated. "A carriage came. Black. Official plates, but no insignia. 2 men stepped out. Sharp suits. One had a folded letter with a Home Office seal. Said they were transferring him to a secure medical ward. Internal orders. I let them take him. Seemed legitimate." Holmes's voice was cold. "Did you read the letter?" "Number, that's against regulation." Holmes stared at the man with something like pity. "My good fellow, the only thing protecting you is the fact that you were intentionally misused. If those men were who they claimed to be, why leave no log? No record of transport? You've been erased from the trail so that no one could ask these very questions." The constable paled slightly. "You think it was a snatch?" "I know it," Holmes said, "and now we must follow it backward. This is no longer a simple matter of disappearance. Fenwick was retrieved, claimed by men who do not officially exist, for reasons no one has the courage to name, so..." Outside, the mist had thickened, now tinged with smoke from the nearby lime kilns. Holmes led us swiftly northward, following some internal compass that took us past the wharves and toward the brick labyrinth of Whitechapel. He spoke little, only pausing once to scribble a brief message which he handed to a street boy with instructions to run it to Inspector Greer. "The message will draw Greer out of his bottle," Holmes said as we resumed our pace. "He's one of the few left who knows how the old doors open, particularly Room 9. The phrase still sat uneasily on my tongue. "You said it was a euphemism." "It is," Holmes replied. "But not merely so. Room 9 was real once. In the bowels of the War Office, a holding place for matters deemed too delicate for public eyes. Interrogation, containment, and at times, elimination. It was shuttered officially years ago, but shadows cast long reflections. You believe Fenwick was taken there, or somewhere made to resemble it. You saw how the name unmoored him. He's either experienced its horrors or was threatened with them." We turned onto a quiet side street and approached a nondescript brownstone. Holmes rapped the door in a peculiar rhythm. 2 short, 1 long, then 1 more. It opened silently. The man who greeted us was a gray-haired clerk in thick spectacles, his fingers ink-stained and his eyes wide with nervous recognition. "Mr. Holmes, I received your message. You said it was urgent." Holmes offered him a firm nod. "Indeed, Mr. Peldon, you worked as an archivist in the Signals Division until last year. You handled intelligence transfers. Do you recall a name? Basil Fenwick?" Peldon's lips parted slightly. "I do. Clean record. Diligent. He requested access to suppressed documents, old cipher cases. Said he was cross-referencing employee clearance levels." "Did he mention Thornley Briar?" "No," Peldon said after a pause. "But he did request files on the Greystone Circle. Some were off-limits. He filed appeals. 3, I believe." Then he stopped. "Why?" "Because the files were removed from internal access. They no longer existed." "Disappeared?" "Expunged," Peldon said, as if they never had been. Holmes's face tightened. "Peldon, I need to know where Room 9 was. Not the myth." The location, Peldon hesitated. "I shouldn't even know, but I was given clearance to deliver records there once. It's not under the War Office anymore. It's beneath the Albion Building, the old military registry near Horse Guards Parade." Holmes's eyes lit with sharp intent. "That building is sealed." "Not from the inside," Peldon said quietly. "They never decommissioned the basement levels." We thanked him and left at once, heading west now, deeper into the seat of power, where the fog gave way to polished iron and clipped accents. Holmes moved with increasing purpose, and I struggled to match his pace as we passed through streets of silent authority. "You see, Watson," he said, "everything points inward. The vanishing files, the false obituary, the coded warning. This is not about a man. This is about what he knew. Briar was a dead man walking, perhaps not of his own volition. Perhaps he agreed to vanish in exchange for silence. And Fenwick, blessed fool, stumbled onto the truth. Then he's a prisoner." "Yes," Holmes said, "but not in a cell, in a story, one designed to end without witnesses." The Albion Building rose before us, its facade austere and abandoned by all appearances. But as we circled to the rear, Holmes paused before a sunken door hidden behind a wrought iron delivery grate. Without a word, he knelt and produced a thin sliver of steel from his coat. The lock clicked open with a whisper. The door gave way to darkness. Holmes turned to me, his face a shadow lit only by certainty. "If I am correct, Watson, the answers lie beneath." And so we descended into the dark, not as detectives, but as trespassers into a truth someone had gone to great lengths to bury. The door groaned faintly as it opened, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into stillness. Holmes led the way with unhurried precision, his lantern cutting a slow arc through the pitch. The air grew colder, thicker, tainted faintly by something I could only describe as institutional age, a mix of mildew, dust, and iron long since tarnished. We descended in silence. The walls closed in, and the ceiling dipped low enough that I had to stoop. Behind us, the door shut with a soft click, leaving only the sound of our footsteps and the steady rasp of Holmes's breath. This was not a place built for welcome or comfort. It had been constructed to contain ideas, perhaps, or people who knew too much. At the bottom of the stairs, we reached a short corridor. The stone gave way to reinforced concrete, and a set of steel doors loomed before us, each with no handle, only a small circular viewing hatch, bolted shut from within. Holmes passed his lantern over the nearest door and read the faded lettering aloud. "Sub-Registrar Storage. Access prohibited." He knelt and examined the threshold, brushing his gloved fingers lightly over the floor. Dust. No one's used this entrance in some time, which means we are either ahead of them or far too late. He rose and motioned for me to follow. The corridor angled left, and a new passage opened before us. This one lined with heavy doors, each bearing numbers stenciled in black. Room 4, Room 6, Room 7. My skin prickled as we passed them. The air was unnaturally still, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Holmes stopped before the 9th door. Room number 9. It looked no different from the others. Steel, bolted, unmarked, save for the number. Yet its presence felt heavier somehow, as though the bricks themselves remembered what had transpired within. Holmes examined the locking mechanism. "Newer than the rest," he murmured. "Recently reinforced. Someone still uses this room." He produced a thin set of tools from his coat, delicate instruments like surgical picks, and set to work. The lock was complex, but Holmes's hands moved with the elegance of a man performing a concerto. After several tense minutes, a soft click echoed in the passageway. The bolt turned. He looked to me once. "Keep your eyes sharp." Then he pushed the door open. The room within was small and windowless. A single desk sat at the center, beside it a cot with a rumpled blanket. The walls were lined with gray filing cabinets, most of them padlocked. But what caught my eye at once was the man slumped in the chair. Holmes moved swiftly to his side and placed 2 fingers to the man's neck. "Alive," he said. "Barely." I stepped forward. "It's Fenwick." He looked gaunt, eyes sunken, cheeks hollowed with sleeplessness. His clothes were wrinkled but intact. No restraints, no signs of struggle. But his gaze, when it fluttered open, held a void I'd seen only in men returned from war. "Basil," I said gently, "you're safe now. We've come to get you out." He blinked. His lips moved, parched and cracked. Holmes handed me a flask, and I tilted it carefully to Fenwick's mouth. He drank with difficulty. His voice came as a whisper. "I didn't tell them. I wouldn't." "Who?" Holmes asked. Fenwick shook his head weakly. "I was never supposed to see it. I found Briar's file, not just his alias, the real one, and the letters. He wasn't acting alone. He was reporting to someone. Still is." "Still is?" I echoed. Fenwick gripped my wrist with sudden, desperate strength. "He's alive. He's not hiding. He's working. With clearance, new name, different department. They buried him sideways. In plain sight." Holmes's expression darkened. "And you tried to expose him?" Fenwick nodded. "Sent letters. 3. One came back opened. I stopped sleeping. Then they brought me here. No charges, no questions. Just silence." Holmes turned toward the cabinets. One hung slightly ajar. Inside were folders, their tabs labeled in old ink. Personnel requests, 1888 to 1895. Holmes rifled quickly until he found a file marked Briar, T, terminated, classified. He pulled it free. Within were only 2 documents. One was a memorandum signed by a Sir M. Lavington, authorizing Briar's elimination and quiet retirement under Section C of some obscure classification code. The second was a false death certificate dated 5 years prior, with a scribbled addendum in a different hand. "Reinstated under Protocol 17A. Do not reopen. H." Holmes stared at the signature. "H. Who would that be?" I asked. But Holmes had turned white. "Hargrave." I knew the name. Sir Ewan Hargrave, once a rising star in internal intelligence, now conveniently retired from public service, but with long fingers that still touched corners of government policy. He had vanished from the spotlight around the time of the Greystone scandal. Holmes stood very still, then turned to me. "We must move. Now this room is not merely a holding space. It is a trap. The moment we accessed it, someone was alerted." As if summoned, a soft whir echoed from the corridor, the unmistakable churn of an electric lift shaft activating deep within the building. Holmes helped Fenwick to his feet, steadying the man's weight across his shoulder. I led the way back through the corridor, the lantern casting our shadows like guilty secrets along the walls. As we reached the stairwell, I heard it, The quiet hiss of metal sliding against metal, a door opening somewhere below. Holmes's voice was taut. "They're coming from beneath. We must exit the way we came." We reached the service door just as it began to resist, a tremble in the hinges. Holmes shoved it open with force, and the three of us stumbled into the alley beyond, gulping cold air like a tonic. Behind us, the Albion building loomed silent once more. No alarm sounded. No pursuit emerged. But we knew what had come close. By the time we reached a waiting cab near Trafalgar Square, Fenwick had slumped into a dazed silence. Holmes directed the driver to Greer's address and sat back, breathing shallowly. Hargrave kept Briar alive because the man knew too much. Rather than silence him, he used him, fed him scraps, moved him like a piece on a chessboard, but now the pieces are spilling off the board. "You have the file," I said. "Not enough." Hargrave didn't just erase Briar. He created an invisible department, one that never appears in ledgers, but steers entire investigations off course. Fenwick saw a glimmer of it, and they buried him for it. "What now?" Holmes looked at me. The fire in his eyes rekindled. "Now, Watson, we burn the veil they hide behind. We bring this to light, not through courts or constables, but by proving, irrefutably, that Thornley Briar never died, that he walks among them still, that he serves a ghost and answers to one name. And that name?" Holmes exhaled slowly. "Room number 9. We arrived at Greer's flat in Fitzrovia under the hush of midnight, the windows dark, save for one lamp flickering behind a thin curtain. Holmes rapped once. Sharp, deliberate. Moments later, the door opened to reveal Greer, dressed but unshaven, his eyes already narrowed with suspicion. "You've brought him," he said, glancing past Holmes to where I helped Fenwick out of the cab. The man could barely stand, his frame lean and trembling, though some spark had returned to his eyes now that he was free of room 9's shadow. Holmes stepped aside. "He's been held without warrant or charge beneath the Albion building. He speaks of a reinstated Thornley Briar and implicates Sir Ewan Hargrave." Greer stood motionless for a moment, the name seeming to hollow the air. Then he stepped back and ushered us in without another word. Inside, the flat was spare but orderly. Maps pinned to walls, stacked documents on side tables, the scent of pipe smoke lingering in the curtains. Holmes laid the Briar file on the desk, while I helped Fenwick into a high-backed chair near the fireplace. Greer lit a fresh lamp and examined the documents in silence. When he reached the second sheet, the one bearing the reinstatement and the single initial H, his jaw clenched. "Hargrave's mark," he said finally. "I'd stake what remains of my career on it. The man built entire departments without oversight. We called him the cabinet's architect, back when he still walked the halls." "Can he be reached?" I asked. "Questioned." Greer gave a dark smile. "Hargrave no longer receives visitors. He dictates his influence from behind foundations so deep you'd need dynamite to unearth him." Holmes's tone was brisk. "Then we don't go to Hargrave. We go to those he used. His hands, not his face." He turned back to Fenwick. "You said Briar had a handler. Still active. Who?" Fenwick's voice was rough, but steadier than before. "Didn't give a name. But I saw letters. He used the name Aldgate. That was the code. Your reports to Aldgate are under review." And something else. A postal box. Eastern District. Number 77. Greer turned pale. Box 77. That's in the Wapping Exchange. One of the last legacy drops from the war. We closed most of them years ago, but some survived under informal use. "Could it be traced?" Holmes asked. "Only if someone collected from it recently. If it's still active, there might be fingerprints, or better, surveillance." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then we must move quickly. The moment they learn Fenwick is missing, they'll wipe every remaining trace of Briar." Greer stood and reached for his coat. "I'll bring the proper clearance. You'll go as consultants. If they block us, I'll call in a favor from Sir Vaughan at Intelligence. He owes me twice and dreads the ledger." By 1:30, we were inside the Wapping Exchange, an unassuming grey building tucked between a shuttered apothecary and a printworks office. Greer's identification passed us through 2 guarded doors. The interior was a quiet maze of old postal boxes and secured chambers, the air tinged with glue and brass polish. We found box 77 in the 3rd row from the end, dustier than its neighbors but not untouched. Holmes examined the latch first, then the surrounding woodwork. "No scratches. Recently opened." He nodded to Greer. "The key?" Greer handed it over, and Holmes unlocked the box. Inside were 2 envelopes. One bore no address, just a string of numbers in thick block lettering. The other was sealed with red wax and bore an imprint, a spoked wheel with a dagger through its hub. Holmes turned the unaddressed envelope over and extracted the contents. A single sheet of paper covered in small, neat cipher. "Polyalphabetic," Holmes murmured. "Not particularly elaborate." "Greer, does this character set match the Greystone files?" Greer leaned closer. "Yes. Modified Visionaire. That was Briar's signature." Holmes pocketed the letter. "Then we have confirmation. He's alive, operating, and communicating." I looked to the second envelope. "What of that?" Holmes did not open it. Instead, he examined the seal with his lens, then carefully scraped a thin layer from the wax and dropped it into a paper packet. "Too careful to be ordinary," he muttered. "If this seal carries trace poison or a reactive chemical, we're not opening it until we're properly prepared." He stood, satisfied, then turned to Greer. "We've crossed the veil. They'll know soon. We must force Briar into the open, if not by the law, then by light. A public reckoning." Greer frowned. "That's no easy feat. The press won't touch it, the courts will be hushed, and Hargrave's name is a key no one dares use." "Then we don't use it," Holmes said quietly. "We use his. We expose Briar himself. Not through accusation, but by proof of his continued existence." "And how do you propose to find a man trained to vanish?" Holmes's smile was razor-thin. "We don't. We let him find us." We returned to Baker Street by 3:30. Holmes declined rest, instead setting to work at once with his cipher wheel, decoding the letter from box 77 while I brewed coffee, and Greer made a secure call from the hallway. The fire hissed and cracked in the grate, and Fenwick slept at last on the settee, his face less strained than before. After an hour, Holmes leaned back and handed me the decoded message. It was brief. "Proceed with Phase 3. The archivist was seen. If he breaks, use extraction protocol. All reports to be routed through usual path. A new name must be prepared. Room 9 is unstable." Greer read it over my shoulder. "They're planning to vanish him again." "No," Holmes corrected. "They're preparing to reassign him, reintegrate Briar under yet another identity." He rose and paced. "This is our moment. They're still moving pieces. We strike before they cement the next mask." Greer tapped his finger against the message. "The archivist, that's Peldon. If they suspect him, he's in danger." "Then he becomes the bait," Holmes said. "We leak a fabricated report that Peldon copied a classified document from Briar's file and passed it to us. We'll use Greer's dead channels, old War Office lines. Briar will come for it himself. If he's truly alive and unsupervised, he'll want to contain the breach personally." I looked up sharply. "And what if he sends someone else?" "Then we follow them. Either way, he'll step into the open, if only to seal the door behind him." The plan was laid bare before the first light of dawn. Greer made the call, code-phrased and targeted. The bait was dangled. And as Holmes stood by the window, eyes cast toward the waking fog of Baker Street, I felt again that strange sense of being swept toward a reckoning not of our own design. Holmes turned, face unreadable. This is the final movement, Watson. The game's deepest player has just been forced to sit at the board. It was just past 7 when the fog began to lift, though the mood in Baker Street remained, thick with tension. Holmes had not slept, nor had he left the window since Greer's final signal was sent. 3 quick taps upon the brass of the fireplace poker, followed by a 4th, slower one, denoting confirmation. The bait had been taken. Somewhere beyond the soot-stained skyline of London, a message had passed into the hands of someone still loyal to the ghost of Thornley Briar. Peldon, the archivist, had agreed to the role reluctantly, but Holmes had persuaded him with cold logic. He was already marked. Better to face the storm on ground we could control than wait for it to arrive unbidden at his doorstep. The false leak had been planted via a discontinued military line, one used only by those with knowledge of the pre-war intelligence network. The message stated simply that Peldon had located a supplemental file attached to Briar's original casework, a file containing the true names of the men in the Greystone cipher circle. We had no such document, of course, but it did not matter. The suggestion alone was enough to rattle the hidden framework. Holmes moved like a man rehearsing a performance only he understood. He adjusted the curtain drawer, repositioned a small mirror to capture the stairwell's reflection, and placed a shallow dish of ash beside the front door, a trick I recognized from the Morstan affair, used to detect uninvited entries. Greer took up position in the adjoining flat, his revolver tucked beneath a ledger, and his ears sharpened for movement in the walls. "Briar will not come by carriage," Holmes said, voice low. "He will come on foot, from an unexpected vector. Through the alley, perhaps, or via the mews. He may even use an intermediary first, to test the water. But come he will." I checked the watch. 8:30. The streets were beginning to wake. Boots striking pavement, barrows creaking over cobbles, the first shout of a newsboy floating faintly through the panes. The world resumed its rhythm while we held our breath. At precisely 9:15, the bell rang. Once, cleanly. Not urgent, not hesitant. Holmes met my eye and gave the barest nod. I opened the door. A man stood on the step. Middle height, grey wool coat, gloves, no hat. His face was undistinguished, the sort that blends into station crowds and meeting halls. But there was something in his posture, his stillness, that suggested calculation. His eyes flicked past me and settled immediately on Holmes. "I was told Mr. Peldon could be found here," the man said mildly. Holmes stepped forward. "He left a message, yes. And you are?" The man smiled faintly. "A courier." Holmes tilted his head. "You'll forgive me. Your shoes are too fine for a clerk, and your hands too unmarked for a porter. You are no courier." The man's smile did not fade. "Then let's not waste time." Holmes stepped aside. "Enter." I closed the door behind him, and for a moment the 4 of us stood as though on stage. The man did not remove his gloves. He stood perfectly centered on the Persian rug, as if acutely aware of the space he occupied. Holmes gestured to the chair. "May I offer you comfort?" The man sat, careful, deliberate. "I came for a package. Nothing more." "And what is this package?" Holmes asked lightly. "You know what I mean." "Ah." Holmes moved to the mantel and poured a measure of tea. "Then I must assume you're acting on behalf of someone who very much prefers not to be named." The man said nothing. Holmes continued, "You are not Briar. That much is plain, but you have spoken with him recently." Still no answer. Holmes turned, letting the silence stretch until it drew taut. "Then allow me to speak plainly. The man you serve does not exist. Not in the ledgers, not in the records, not even in the official corridors he once occupied. He has survived by masquerading as his own absence. But he made one mistake. He trusted you to retrieve something that doesn't exist." The man's eyes flicked upward, the faintest sign of discomfort. Holmes stepped closer. "There is no file. No list, only a decoy, and now you've delivered yourself. Have I? The man stood abruptly. Perhaps I was sent to confirm you had nothing, to see whether the bait held substance. Or, Holmes said, voice like steel, perhaps you are lying. And perhaps Briar is watching now, through your eyes, through your steps, through your mistakes. I moved closer to the door, quietly drawing the latch. The man's calm cracked just slightly. We can end this quietly, Mr. Holmes. Forget the name. Forget the past. Let it die. You've proven your point. Holmes took another step forward. But the past does not die. It accumulates. It waits. The man's hand moved subtly toward his pocket. Before he could reach it, the door behind him burst open. Greer stood with his revolver drawn, voice clipped. Hands where we can see them. The man froze, then slowly raised his hands. Holmes nodded. Doctor. Watson, search him. I did so swiftly. In his left coat pocket I found a folded letter, the seal matching the spoked wheel we had seen before. Beneath it, tucked into the lining, a smaller envelope marked only with the letter B. Holmes examined both. A reply packet, likely intended for Briar's eyes alone. Greer stepped forward. We'll need to hold you for questioning. The Home Office will be notified. The man gave a slow, ironic smile. You've no proof? You can't even name me. No, Holmes said, but you can name him. Greer gestured sharply. Take him. Two plainclothes men, Holmes's irregulars in borrowed constable garb, emerged from the stairwell and escorted the man out. Holmes waited until the door had shut and silence resumed before breaking the seal on the small envelope. Inside was a card, blank on one, side on the other, a name written in neat, formal script. Hargrave/Chancery House, room 32. Greer's breath caught. He's resurfaced, using an old judicial branch address, untraceable by normal channels. Holmes folded the card slowly. He's grown bold. Perhaps he thinks we lack the will. Greer looked to him. What will you do? Holmes's voice was quiet, but final. I will go and knock. And in that moment, I saw it, the tension in his frame, the flicker of fury beneath the surface. Holmes had glimpsed the architecture of a lie built across years, and now, brick by brick, he intended to bring it down. The streets of London had taken on a strange clarity by midday, the fog retreating beneath a steady wind that cut through the alleyways with surgical precision. Holmes had not spoken since we departed Baker Street, save for a clipped instruction to have Greer coordinate discreet surveillance around Chancery House. He walked with the calm of one who has waited years for a door to open, and now, with hand outstretched, was about to knock. Chancery House, as we soon learned, was the sort of building designed to be overlooked. Sandwiched between the registry courts and a derelict book bindery, its unmarked stone facade bore no sign, no placard, nothing that might suggest its purpose or inhabitants. Even the number above the door, 32, was carved shallowly, as if the stone itself were reluctant to reveal the truth. Holmes ascended the steps without hesitation. I followed, heart thudding with something close to dread. He rapped on the door once with the head of his cane. There was no answer. He tried the knob. It turned easily. Inside, the air was dry and still. A clerk's desk sat beneath an iron chandelier, but no clerk was present. A stack of parchment sat untouched, the pen beside it dry and stiff with ink. A corridor ran left and right from the foyer, lined with frosted glass doors. Holmes scanned the directory, a brass plate on the wall whose entries had all been scratched out save one. 32, Sir E. Hargrave. Advisory. We climbed the staircase slowly, the creak of the steps echoing up the narrow shaft. At the landing, we found the door already ajar. Holmes pushed it gently open. Hargrave's office was not what I expected. There was no grandeur, only precision. Everything was arranged just so. The inkstand perfectly centered, papers aligned at right angles, a single lamp trimmed low. The scent of old leather and dust hovered in the air, and there, seated behind the desk, was the man himself. Sir Ewan Hargrave. He was older than his portrait in the intelligence annals, but unmistakable. High forehead, hawk-like eyes, hands that rested calmly upon the blotter, as though time itself had paused at his command. He did not rise. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a low voice. "And Doctor Watson, I wondered when you'd arrive." Holmes did not sit. "You knew we were coming. I would have been disappointed otherwise." There was no pretense of civility between them. This was not a negotiation, nor a confession. It was a meeting long deferred, between the architect of hidden mechanisms and the man who made the unseen visible. "You've been clever," Holmes said, "but not clever enough. Thornley Briar lives. You had him buried, then you brought him back, rebranded, repurposed. Used him to run your errands in silence." Hargrave's expression did not change. "He served his country." "He served you," Holmes replied coldly. "And when the stain became too deep, you made him a ghost. Now he's resurfaced, pulling strings with your imprimatur, accessing archives, ordering detentions, disappearing men." "Such things were never meant for your world, Mr. Holmes," Hargrave said quietly. "Not for courtrooms or headlines or the common tongue. Do you know what it is to keep a country whole? What sacrifices are required? What omissions must be made for the greater peace?" Holmes's voice was iron. "I know the moment one begins believing silence is a virtue, the truth begins to rot." Hargrave stood now, slowly. He was tall still, his presence severe, but there was weariness in the way he moved. "You want to expose me. But to what end? You think a judge will try me? You think a headline will undo the years?" "No, Mr. Holmes. I do not fear your revelations. I pity your faith in them." Holmes reached into his coat and placed a single sheet of paper on the desk. A transcript of Briar's ciphered message, signed under the alias Green, routed through Box 77. It implicates you by implication and by the very structure of its encryption. It contains phrasing that matches your own classified directives from the Greystone files. I imagine the committee would be intrigued to compare them. Hargrave eyed the page but did not touch it. "And what of Briar?" he asked. "We have him, or we will," Holmes said. "He's already broken cover once. He'll do it again. And when he does, your house of illusions will collapse with him." Hargrave looked at me then, for the first time. "Do you know, Doctor, what your friend is playing with? Not justice, not principle. He is pulling at threads woven into the national garment. When they fray, it is not just the guilty who fall through. It is the fabric itself. I've seen enough broken men stitched into that garment to know the cost," I replied. "Whatever cloak you think you've been wearing, sir, it is threadbare." A silence fell. Then, to my astonishment, Hargrave smiled. "Perhaps," he said softly, "perhaps it is time." He opened a drawer. Holmes stiffened, but Hargrave produced only a key. He placed it beside the transcript. "Albion Building, Sub-Level 3, Archive Room A. You will find the original directive there, and the names." He looked up, eyes suddenly very old. "There are no innocents in war, Mr. Holmes. Only those who survive it." Holmes took the key without a word. We left the office moments later, the door shutting behind us with a soft finality. Neither of us spoke until we reached the street. At last, Holmes turned to me. "That was not a confession," he said. "It was permission." I frowned. "He's giving you the truth?" "Number, he's giving me the last page of a book he wrote, and dares me to read it aloud." We returned to Baker Street in silence. Greer was waiting, the courier in custody and Fenwick safe at a hospital ward under an assumed name. Holmes handed Greer the key. "Take it to the committee. Let them open the file. Let them see what ghosts walk their corridors." "And you?" Greer asked. Holmes looked out the window toward a city both older and more fragile than we had imagined. "I've done what I can," he said quietly. "The rest belongs to men with broader shoulders and stronger stomachs." As the day darkened and rain began to fall, I sat beside Holmes once more, the fire warm against the chill. He did not speak. He only watched the world beyond the glass, eyes unreadable, hands still. And I knew that though the case had ended, something deeper had shifted, not only in Holmes, but in the fragile line between secrecy and salvation we all so blindly trust. Evening fell quietly over Baker Street, with only the occasional patter of light rain against the panes to remind us that the world had not stopped with the revelations of the day. Holmes had not stirred from his armchair, nor had he spoken since handing over the key to Greer. The fire, once crackling, had diminished to a soft glow, and the silence between us was not the comfortable stillness we so often shared, but something more reflective, like the pause at the close of a symphony before the audience dares to applaud. I made tea in the kitchen with steady hands, less out of thirst than ritual. When I returned, Holmes was holding the folded cipher from box 77 again, the decoded message scrawled in his own hand beside it. His eyes scanned the lines, not as if searching for something he had missed, but as if studying the trace of an idea that still resisted capture. "They will not prosecute Hargrave," he said at last, voice low. "No," I agreed. "Too many doors would be forced open in the process. Too many names would fall into the light." He nodded once. "The committee may sequester the files, perhaps retire Breyer again, under another invented death. A few quiet reshuffles, a few forgotten oaths, but the truth won't reach daylight." "Yet we know," I said. Holmes looked at me then, and his expression bore something beyond fatigue. It was disillusionment, a rare visitor to his face. "Yes," he said quietly. "And knowledge, Watson, in this case, is a kind of poison." I set his tea beside him. "And yet you pursued it." "I had no choice. The moment Fenwick placed that bloodied handkerchief on my table, the game had already begun." I sat across from him, the weight of the case pressing on both our shoulders now. Fenwick remained under protection, his name purged from the official registry and replaced with a string of numbers known only to Greer's few trusted agents. The man had barely begun to recover his health, and Holmes had insisted he be allowed the peace of obscurity rather than the farce of public vindication. "What of Breyer?" I asked. Holmes leaned back slightly, fingers tapping the ciphered note. "He has not resurfaced, but he will not run. Not now. Hargrave's decision to yield that key was a signal. A command, perhaps. Breyer will be silenced quietly or absorbed into some deeper corner of the machine. Either way, he ceases to be our concern." It was not like Holmes to speak in terms of surrender. I recognized the bitterness in his voice, not as regret for what had been done, but for the deeper truth that justice, in such matters, had no court to stand in. After a long moment, he stood and moved toward the fireplace, taking with him the cipher, the decoded transcript, and the copy of Hargrave's signature from the Breyer file. He paused for only a moment before setting them to the flame. The fire hissed and flared, consuming the edges, then the center, then curling the ink into gray whispers. "No record?" I asked softly. "No weapon," he replied. We both understood. Some truths, when written down, grow teeth. Later that night I walked home beneath a clearing sky, the rain having rinsed the city clean of its usual grime. But the damp cobblestones reflected back more than gaslight. They reflected the story we had followed to its end. Or rather, to the point where stories like these cease to belong to detectives and begin to be swallowed by history. 2 days passed without event. On the third morning, Greer arrived at Baker Street unannounced, his face shadowed but alert. Holmes met him with a single glance and gestured for me to join them. "We've closed the archive," Greer said without preamble. Room 9 is officially sealed. The committee classified the entire Briar affair under Section 32. Internal only. No inquiry. No official acknowledgement. Holmes did not look surprised. They found Briar, Greer continued. Or rather, he came to them, surrendered, left a message for you. He withdrew a slip of paper from his coat and handed it to Holmes. The handwriting was small, rigid, controlled. It read, "We serve in silence, or we serve ourselves." I chose the latter. Perhaps next time you'll choose better. T.B. Holmes read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it into his desk drawer. He said nothing. Greer rose. "The committee has asked me to express their appreciation, though not officially, of course." "I require none," Holmes replied. Greer nodded and took his leave. We sat in silence for some time afterward. Outside, the first hint of spring bird song drifted faintly over the rooftops, a reminder that time moved onward despite the shadows men left behind. At length, Holmes lit his pipe and turned to me. "You know, Watson, I often contemplate the cases we have solved, the murderers unmasked, the thieves undone, the webs of deception cleared away. But this one will never settle in the mind like the others." "It wasn't meant to," I said. He gave a faint smile. "Perhaps not. And yet—" He trailed off, staring once more toward the window, as though searching for something just beyond the edge of what could be seen. "Perhaps the value of this case," he continued quietly, "was not in what we discovered, but in proving that even the deepest shadows can feel the pressure of light, however briefly." I watched him then, not as the world's greatest consulting detective, but as a man who had peered into a depth few dared acknowledge. And I realized that for all his brilliance, Holmes did not revel in what he found there. That night he filed the case under a false name, not in the usual record of our shared adventures, but in a private drawer marked with a single symbol, a dagger through a spoked wheel. It would never be published, but I remember. And I write it now, not to cast blame, nor to demand action, but to remind those who believe in easy boundaries that sometimes the most dangerous ghosts are not the ones we chase, but the ones we create to serve us and forget to bury. For Holmes, the case was closed. For me, it will never quite be. It was a week later, under the pale calm of a rainless dusk, that the final piece fell into place, not with drama, nor with a clash of violence or rhetoric, but with a quiet knock upon the door of Baker Street. Holmes and I had just concluded a brief consultation concerning a stolen antique from a Soho collector, a matter so laughably transparent that even I could have solved it in 20 minutes. The real work had ended days before, or so we thought. Mrs. Hudson admitted a messenger, an unassuming boy with ink-stained fingers and a nervous look. He handed Holmes a sealed envelope, said nothing, and vanished before we could question him. Holmes examined the paper, frowning. The wax seal was blank. No insignia, no mark. He broke it with the tip of his penknife and withdrew a single sheet, on which was written only an address, and beneath it, a name that froze me in my seat. Fenwick. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He sent for us. Is it a trap? Too subtle for a trap. This is a summoning, one final truth. The address led us through narrow mews off Kensington Road to a modest row house nestled between a bookshop and a crumbling chapel. The windows were curtained, the curtains drawn. A gas lamp flickered above the door. Inside, Fenwick awaited us. He stood unaided now, a robe draped over his frame, color returning to his cheeks, but it was his eyes that had changed, clearer, calmer, as if some unseen storm had passed. I wasn't followed, he said quietly. I've waited until I was sure. Holmes nodded once. You were right not to trust their protection. Fenwick motioned to a table where tea had been prepared. We sat. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Fenwick placed a worn black notebook on the table between us. I lied to you, he said. Holmes did not react. Go on. I said I only saw Briar's file, but I found more. Hargrave's ledger, hidden in a decommissioned drawer under an alias. He had kept it for years, a journal of operations, details not meant for any committee or archive. There was a reason they buried him quietly. It wasn't only what he'd done. It was what he still knew. Holmes opened the book and turned the first few pages. I caught glimpses, code names, routes, allocations of funds to operations never publicly acknowledged. Then Holmes stopped, finger tapping a line near the center. Opus Sirocco, H to TB, immediate action, redirect to civilian cover, record erased, witness retained, F. My heart sank. Fenwick saw my expression. Yes, that's me. I wasn't just an incidental discoverer. I was a participant. 15 years ago, I was a clerk. Nothing more. But I saw too much. An order, misfiled, naming an asset we were told had been dead 3 years. Holmes closed the book slowly. They kept you alive because you were useful and obedient. Fenwick nodded. I lived in that shadow, quietly, until I grew tired of the lies. When I began looking into Greystone again, they panicked. Not because of Briar, but because of Hargrave. He'd built more than a ghost. He'd built an empire of discretion. Holmes stood. And now you give it to us. I give it to you, Fenwick said, because no one else will act. They'll seal it, redact it, bury it deeper. But you will do what I can't. Holmes looked down at the notebook in his hand. Number I won't. Fenwick's face twisted in confusion. But I will not act through this, Holmes said quietly. It is not the evidence that matters. It is the pattern it reveals. A man can be erased, a file can be altered, but an idea, that cannot be so easily killed. And what this ledger proves is that the idea always returns. I understood then. Holmes did not need to expose Hargrave's crimes. He had already done so by pulling the ghost of Thornley Briar into the light, by forcing the men behind the curtain to shuffle, retreat, and adjust. The machine had been wounded, even if not dismantled. It had felt the reach of consequence, and that, perhaps, was all that could be achieved. Fenwick bowed his head. Then what should I do? Live, Holmes said, but not quietly. Watch. Remember, when the pattern emerges again, and it will, be ready. We left the house soon after, the notebook sealed in a brown satchel slung under Holmes's coat. We walked in silence through the gathering dark, the wind rising softly behind us. At the corner of Gloucester Road, I asked him, "Will you keep it?" He glanced down at the satchel. "No." "Destroy it?" "No." "Then what?" He stopped, and his gaze drifted upward to the stars just beginning to pierce the veil of London's smoke. "I will hide it where men like Hargrave never look," he said. "In plain sight." We returned to Baker Street before midnight. Holmes placed the ledger in a hollowed law volume titled On the Origins of Administrative Hierarchy, a book no casual reader would ever touch, and slid it into the shelf between volumes on criminal anthropology and ancient forgery. As I prepared to retire, Holmes settled once again into his chair, pipe in hand, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know, Watson," he said, "there are few certainties in this world, but one is this. The men who manipulate silence often forget that silence is not stillness. It carries weight, and eventually it makes a sound of its own." I nodded, watching him as he drew the first curl of smoke from his pipe. "And when it does," he added, "I intend to be listening." And with that, the case, stranger and more insidious than any we had yet encountered, was closed not by handcuffs or headlines, but by quiet defiance. For even in a world ruled by shadows, the light still knew how to wait, 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 still knew how to wait.